Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm here to present Simon Winchester, who studied geology at Oxford and has written for Condé Nast Traveler, Smithsonian, and the National Geographic. He's the author of A Crack in the Edge of the World, Krakatoa, The Map That Changed the World, The Professor and the Madman, The Fracture Zone, Outposts, Korea, among many other titles. But he's here today to talk to us about The Man Who Loved China. He's a notable New York Times bestseller and has appeared on numerous best and notable lists. Mr. Winchester was made Officer of the Order of the British Empire by Her Majesty the Queen in 2006. He lives in Massachusetts and in the Western Isles of Scotland, and he also has an apartment 2-3 blocks from here, right? One block. So, ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome Simon Winchester.
Well, thanks very much indeed. About 15 years ago, I think it was, I was writing a book about the Yangtze River, and I spent about a year traveling all the way from Shanghai, where it debouches into the sea, up to a place called Gelandandong in Tibet, where it rises. And I'm sure most of you are familiar with the river. It's the second or third longest in the world, nearly 4,000 miles. But the part that, when I got back here to New York to write the book, the part that I was particularly interested in was the 300 or so miles where it squeezes itself through a couple of ranges of mountains and flows with extreme speed and ferocity through what used to be known as the Three Gorges, which was a very dramatic and tumultuous part of the river, which is not at all dramatic or tumultuous now because they built a dirty great dam, which has turned it into a 600-mile-long lake full of sewage, which isn't at all attractive. However, for thousands of years, it was a raging torrent, and I was very interested to know how sailing junks managed to get up those 300 miles against the stream, because they clearly did. There's a big city called Wuhan at the south and a big city called Chongqing 300 miles away. How did these junks manage to get up against all the turbulence and the rapids and the waterfalls and so forth? Well, I was having dinner with someone here in New York who knows a lot about ships, and he said, well, the two obvious books to look at are G.R.G. Worcester, The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze, which was published in Maryland in the 1940s, or Volume 4, Part 3 of Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham. Now, I'd heard of neither book and neither author, but I think that conversation took place on a Friday. And the following day, Saturday, I was up near where I live in the Berkshires, in Salisbury, Connecticut, where there used to be a wonderful, wonderful bookstore called Lion's Head Books, owned by a man called Mike McCabe. And it was one of those bookstores that had everything, and Mike knew everything about books. But the bookstore is now defunct. Mike, I'm happy to say, is not, but the bookstore doesn't exist. But anyway, I went in there and I said, Mike, two obscure volumes. I wonder if you at least might be able to order them. The first is called The Junks and Sampans of the Yangtze. And he said, oh, G.R.G. Worcester. And I said, yes, Mike. He said, well, we normally have a copy in stock. And it was a very large format book. And he looked at an upper shelf and plucked one down. He said, yeah, there we are, $25. And I said, you're an amazing guy. Well, all right, the next one's really obscure then. Have you ever heard of a book called Science and Civilization in China? And his expression changed. He looked at me as if I was something that the cat had dragged into the store. He said, you do, of course, mean Joseph Needham. And I said, I think I do. He said, are you telling me you've never heard of Joseph Needham? And I said, Mike, I'm terribly sorry. I haven't, I must confess. And he said, well, you ought to be thoroughly ashamed of yourself. Joseph Needham is the most famous Englishman ever to have lived in China. And he changed the entire world's perception of China. He wrote this book, which must have gone into 20 volumes. We very occasionally get single volumes. We never get complete sets. It's still in print, Cambridge University Press, but a full set would cost thousands. But from time to time, we get single volumes. And I think we've got a volume downstairs. And he disappeared like the white rabbit into his lair and came back a few moments later with an enormous fat tome of a book. And he blew the dust off it and looked at it and said, Science and Civilization in China by Joseph Needham, Volume 4, Part 3. The very one I was wanting to buy, $75. So for $100, I got from this extraordinary bookstore both titles I wanted. And I took them out to the car and sat reading them, and obviously junks and sampans of the Yangtze, we knew what that was about, but I had no idea what Science and Civilization in China, this particular volume, was. So I opened it, 980 pages, an enormous tome, everything to do with China's historical relationship with water. So it was about lighthouses and canals and lock gates and the use of the compass and designs of sails and rudders and anchors. And indeed, it had startlingly accurate diagrams of the exact kind of boats I was looking at and wanting to know about. And I sat there enthralled by this volume and thinking, who on earth was the guy that put this together? And not just this volume, but if what Mike had said was to be believed, 20-odd other volumes of similar magisterial authority and heft related to astronomy and biology and chemistry and engineering and ceramics and zoology. Who was he? And I sort of vowed to myself there and then that although I'd never written a biography, that one day I'd look into his life and see if I could write a book about him. Well, it turned out that Joseph Needham was every bit as extraordinary as the book that he wrote and that I saw that day. And I looked into his life starting about 4 years ago and came up with this book, which came out last summertime. He was an amazing fellow. He was born in London in 1900, although how he came to be born or conceived, I no real idea, because his parents completely loathed one another. Father was also called Joseph Needham. He was a rather ascetic doctor. He was an anesthetist or an anesthesiologist, I think you call it in this country. His wife, Alicia, was French-Irish, and as far as one can tell, completely mad. I'm sure this had nothing to do with her being either French or Irish, but she drank like a fish. She sang at inappropriate moments. She shopped like there was no tomorrow. She swore like a drunken sailor. And the two of them completely loathed each other. And China and so forth was being thrown all the time. Neighbors were complaining. They lived in South London. So how they managed ever to have the peace and quiet for the few moments necessary to conceive a child, I don't know. But evidently they must have done sometime in the spring of 1900, because just before Christmas there was born to them this small boy. And they disagreed at the font over what they should call him. Father wanted him called, the boy was called Noel Joseph Terence Montgomery Needham, because father wanted him to be called Noel, mother wanted him to be called Terence, and in a sort of spirit of filial compromise, he decided that he would call himself Joseph. Well, his father, although strict and somewhat severe, was a kindly man and a very good educationalist. And one of the things that he was determined to see was that his son learned language. And by the time he was, I think, 9, by dint of taking him abroad and subjecting him to a fairly rigorous classical examination education system, the young boy spoke, I think, 7 languages. He had Greek and Latin, which he certainly read and wrote, but he also had French and German and Spanish and Italian, and was extremely competent in language, which of course would serve him in good stead later on in life. But his father educated him in all sorts of other ways as well. He taught him to drive steam railway trains, which was not an obvious thing to do to a child, but he also had many doctor friends, including one extraordinary surgeon who called Sir John Bland Sutton, who was the inventor of the hysterectomy, among other things. And he would invite the young Joseph, by now 11 or 12 years old, to come and assist at operations, something that I'm sure people wouldn't allow these days, but young Joseph assisted in the operating on young women's nether regions and passed, catgut and so forth to Sir John Bland Sutton, and was paid a guinea a day for doing so. So he came to know female anatomy very well, which also, as you'll hear, served him in good stead later. Sir John was also interested peculiarly in the lemur, this Madagascan primate, and apparently lemurs have a predisposition to cataracts. Who knew, but apparently they do. And Sir John performed operations on afflicted lemurs, pro bono, one imagines, and invited Joseph to attend these operations as well. So by the time he was entering his teenage years, he had 7 languages, he had a knowledge of how to drive steam railway trains, he knew about the nether regions of ladies, and he knew about the ocular arrangements of lemurs. So he was clearly on the way to becoming a rather extraordinary fellow. His father also posted up sort of mantras all around the house, things that he wanted his son to follow. One of them, maybe you're familiar with this, I wasn't, but I now find I follow it to the letter, which is never go upstairs empty-handed. And I find when I see a staircase, I have to frantically look for something to carry upstairs. Never have 3 helpings of anything. No knowledge is ever to be wasted or despised, which seems to me a very fair thing to say. You can catch more flies with honey than with vinegar. And I think probably the most important thing in guiding Needham's life was said not by his father, but by his headmaster at Oundle, which is a private school in the Midlands of England. And the headmaster, a man called F.W. Sanderson, who was well enough known as an educationalist to have his biography written by H.G. Wells, said to the young boy, he said, don't think about small things, the pettifogging, the details. Think big, think in oceans. And thinking in oceans, I think, was something that guided Needham throughout his career. Well, he was evidently clever enough and intellectually equipped enough to get a place at Cambridge in 1918, and specifically at Caius College, Cambridge, which is a college which was made well known in this country through that film Chariots of Fire. I don't know if you'll remember it, made about 20 years ago. So he went up to Caius to read medicine, but I hope none of you are or were or have parents that are or were doctors, but he was quickly disabused of this and told that medicine was too non-intellectual a pastime, and that the future, my boy, lies in atoms and molecules. And so he was persuaded to change his course to chemistry, and read chemistry, got a fair to middling degree, and sufficiently good to be allowed to go on to do a PhD in the newly formed Department of Biochemistry, which had just been set up in Cambridge by a man called Sir Frederick Gowland Hopkins, who went on in 1926, I think it was, to win the Nobel Prize for the discovery of vitamins or vitamins. So it was obviously a very cutting-edge, leading-edge, bleeding-edge kind of place. And Needham, his particular interest was on embryology, on how an egg, a thing made of shell and albumin and yolk, turns into something filled with feathers and bones and beaks and blood and all that sort of stuff. So this was a very new discipline, and he set to it with sufficient ardor that everyone in Cambridge recognized him as being an extraordinary man, and people were saying he is the Erasmus of his time and clearly very, very clever. It's clever enough that at the age of 24, Caius made him into a fellow, which is the equivalent of tenure. He was, for the rest of his life, he was settled. And I mention it mainly because, excuse me, he was given a room at Cambridge in the centre court, which has some interest today. The college itself was built in the 14th century, so the room was fairly antique. It's room K1, and it used to be occupied before Needham took it over in 1925 by a zoologist, Sir William Bate Hardy. But Needham then had it for the next 70 years of his life. But when he died, it was passed to its present occupant. And if you go as a tourist to the central court of Caius College and look at K1, you can see that it's occupied by the cosmologist Stephen Hawking. So it's rather a nice illustration of the sort of continuity of Cambridge intellectual life. Well, anyway, so he had a room, he now had tenure, he very happily doing his biochemistry, and it was during this period, the early 20s, that he began to develop the oddities for which he later became known. The first, I suppose, wasn't an oddity, really. He was, and ever since 1917 had been, and he would be for the remainder of his life, an ardent socialist. I mean, he believed very much in what had happened in the revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. And he really, although never joining the Communist Party, he was intellectually, a lifelong Marxist. But also, and it's a sort of indication of the way that he balanced opposing or conflicting views in his life. I mean, he was a bridge between East and West. He built bridges between his mother and his father. But also, in this case, the opposite of Marxism, for him anyway, was Christianity. He was a very keen, muscular Cambridge Christian. It took him some time to find a church that would accommodate a man with rigorously Marxist views, but he did in the end. He found it in a village called Thaxted, and the church had the most extraordinary vicar called Conrad Noel, who was extremely left-wing, rather eccentric. He preached all his sermons on Sunday with a parrot sitting on his shoulder, and he would allow things like on the spire of the church, he would fly St. George's flag of England, but also the flag of Sinn Féin to show solidarity with Irish nationalism. And this would prompt sort of right-wing swells from Cambridge, 12 miles away, to come down to the church and try and get up the steeple to pull down this offending Irish flag. And this called rioting in the streets into this otherwise totally peaceful English village, and tremendous brouhaha. And of course, Needham thought it was enormous fun, so he stayed with that church for the rest of his life. So he's a Marxist and he's a Christian, and he also, in the 1920s, developed a keen practical interest in something that was then called gymnosophy. I don't know how many of you know what gymnosophy is, but it was the polite word in the 20s for nudism. He loved taking his clothes off at every possible opportunity, and he had a sort of serious political reason for doing so, in that he thought that once people take their silks and their satins and frills and furbelows off, they are as one with their fellow man, or if, apart from the lumpy bits, with fellow women as well. So there was a socialist aspect to this, and he found the London Gymnosophy Society, which he joined, and then fortunately near Cambridge there was a group with a somewhat odd name, although Americans seem to think it's appropriate, called the Moonella Group. And he joined the Moonella Group and then took off his clothes with, I was going to say gay abandon, but with abandon. He also did other things. He became very interested, largely due to Conrad Noel's wife's enthusiasm. In fact, he became a Morris dancer. I don't know if you know what Morris dancing is. It's a strange sort of English pagan dancing tradition. You put straw and bells on your wrists, and you dance in a really wild, gyrating fashion to tuneless music played on a pipe. There's no suggestion, thank God, that he ever performed these dances nude, but he was a very keen dancer. Once again, for the rest of his life, he also played the accordion, and people said, well, at least, thank God, being a nudist, he didn't play the cymbals. But I pointed out that the accordion would do exactly the same job, although rather more slowly. He also was, and I just mention it for the record, a keen chain smoker, and he would smoke. Well, he never would smoke. He lived till 95, so it clearly didn't do him too much harm. But he would never, maybe this was the reason he did live so long, he wouldn't smoke until the clock at the center of Keyes College, the one that was famous in Chariots of Fire. If you saw the film, when he would balance a cigarette on his desk, and the moment the clock had struck the final bell of 12, he would then light up and smoke like industrial Manchester for the rest of the day. So he was a smoker. And the one other thing which I should mention, because it absolutely defined his life, is that he was an inveterate womanizer. He loved women. He was extremely tall, a shock of thick brown hair, round spectacles. He looked like Harry Potter on steroids. Women found him tremendously attractive, and similarly, he found them attractive. And as it happened, as someone wrote about the Biochemistry Institute, that it was filled with clever Jews and talkative young women. And he found both equally appealing, although I suspect the talkative young women were somewhat more to his fancy, and he dated, I don't know if that was the word, he courted, I'm sure, all of these women one by one, and eventually settled upon one of them called Dorothy Moyle, who was the daughter of a Quaker from Devon in southwest England. And she was an expert or doing a PhD on the mechanics of muscles, these kind of muscles in your arm. And he rather lamely said, as I do eggs and you do ham, I think we should clearly get together. They courted, they dated, and they married. And he chose Friday the 13th of September 1924, I think it was, to marry, but declared, I think somewhat to Dorothy's surprise, on their wedding day, that theirs was to be a thoroughly modern marriage, not to be constrained by the rigorous bourgeois tedium of fidelity, but if either of them found someone else with whom they wished to amuse themselves, that was to be condoned, and it was absolutely all right. And looking at Dorothy's diaries, which are extensive, I don't think she ever once strayed from the path of total marital rectitude. The same cannot be said of Joseph, who seems, from the moment they returned from their honeymoon in France, to have hit the ground running, and few Cambridge women of the time were completely free from his attentions. But those who I interviewed said actually it was terribly nice. He was polite and lovely, and we enjoyed being seduced by this rather roguish biochemist. So the two of them settled down then in Cambridge through the late 1920s and 30s to a fairly conventional left-wing Christian, nudist, chain-smoking, Morris dancing, accordion playing, biochemical life. Needham wrote, and I think this is the first time we see the advice about thinking in oceans coming true. He wrote in his late 20s a book on embryology, chemical embryology, 3 volumes, still has biblical authority today. And he clearly was intrigued by writing massive, massive books. But, as I say, everything unrolled in a relatively ordinary Cambridge way until everything changed in 1937. The summer of 1937, there arrived in Cambridge from China a young, very attractive, intensely clever, petite Chinese woman from Nanjing called Lu Guizhen. And Guizhen had come from Eastern China to Cambridge largely because she had heard of the reputation of the Needhams. They were very active in their support for the right side in the Spanish Civil War, and that became known in left-wing circles in China. And Guizhen, because she wanted to do a PhD, came to Cambridge with the specific intention of studying for her degree under the supervision of Dorothy Needham. So she took a ship from Shanghai to London, and then a train from London to Cambridge, came to the Biochemical Institute on charmingly named Tennis Court Road, saw Dorothy, signed up, as it were, and then walked down the corridor to see Joseph Needham, whom she imagined to be a sort of elderly, white-bearded chap. Door was opened by this tall, loud, boisterous, enthusiastic Harry Potter on speed kind of figure, and the two of them developed an instant attraction for one another, and I think it's fair to say, right from the start, fell in love. But the interesting thing is that the relationship was not consummated throughout that autumn and winter of 1937, and looking painstakingly through his diaries, which were written in impeccable, not only were they complete, but totally readable because Joseph's handwriting was so beautiful, every last detail of their relationship was recorded, and they went away abroad together, and indeed the 3 of them went away abroad. They were all very good friends, known as the Needhams. But the actual moment of consummation didn't come until February the 17th, 1938, and it's worth lingering over because for Needham at least, and I would suggest for the wider world, everything, it was as if the earth tilted on its axis momentarily. That day began with a reference in Greek in his diary. Every reference that Needham ever made to Dorothy, he always wrote in Greek for some reason. So he wrote Dorothy to Babbacombe. Babbacombe is a village in Devon where she came from. I'm sure this is the first time in Babbacombe's very long history its name has ever been rendered into Greek, but he sent her away to see her parents. So leaving the coast cleared, Joseph and Guizhen were now alone in Cambridge. So as the diary tells, he first of all took her to a movie, a film, which had just opened in England that week and had opened in Cambridge specifically. And it was Pearl Buck's The Good Earth, which he possibly, if one is a cynic, might think would render this young woman from Eastern China nostalgic and perhaps to a degree pliant. Anyway, to reinforce this pliancy, he then took her to what was then the most expensive Italian restaurant in Cambridge called the Venetian, and he kept everything, and so the receipts from that 17th of February are still there in the archives. It was clear that wine was taken in some abundance that evening, so this would obviously reinforce the pliancy. He then took Guizhen back to his rooms, Stephen Hawking's rooms to be in Keyes College, K1, and then, according to the diary, well, there are 3 asterisks, which to a man of relatively normal prurient imagination must say that something happened, or maybe something happened 3 times. But anyway, but it's not so much that that's important, it's what's after the 3 asterisks that's important. Because there you see, first in pencil, and then when he's got the confidence, committed to ink, the first ever Chinese character that Needham ever writes in his life. Now, if anyone's read this book, please don't blurt it out, but I would love to know what you think that character might be. Would anyone like to hazard a guess? Those who know, please don't say, but does anyone like to say what it might have been? No one with a dirty mind here? Well, most people, I'll spare your misery, most people say love, which is fine, but not true. The character love actually appears on the jacket here of the book, but it's not love, and nor is it eternity, and nor is it her name, Gui Zhen, in Chinese, nor is it the Chinese euphemism for sex, which is often clouds and rain. It's not that. It is much more prosaic. It is the 19 strokes which make up the character, or the 2 characters, for cigarette. And when you think about it, they were both chain smokers. And if you've seen that film Now Voyager, he had this habit of lighting 2 cigarettes. So after the 3 asterisk event was over, he then reached over to the bedside table, took 2, he smoked Players Navy cut cigarettes, lit 2, passed 1 to Gui Zhen beside him, inhaled, exhaled, rolled the tube of Virginia tobacco between his thumb and forefinger, and turned to Gui Zhen and said, "How do I write this in Chinese?" And she showed him. And as he wrote later, everything changed. It was as if a door opened into an utterly alien universe. And he stepped through this door, and he was never to be the same person again. He entered the glittering, crystalline world of Chinese ideographic writing. And from that moment on, he was completely and totally obsessed with and in love with China. First of all, with the Chinese language, and then with China itself. And Gui Zhen, very painstakingly, she said it was like teaching a child, taught him Chinese. He then managed to persuade the professor of Chinese at Cambridge, a man called Gustav Halun, to help him. The result being that by the early 1940s, he could read and write 5,500 characters of Chinese impeccably, because his writing and his photographic memory was peerless, and under the tutelage of the 2 of them, began to learn the tonality of speaking it. Now, step back from that. That's the scenario in Cambridge, but consider the situation of China in the early 1940s. This was a country which really for the previous 200 years had been regarded with utter disdain in the West. It was being racked by problems of one sort or another ever since the Opium Wars of the 1840s. Westerners, the British, of course, notoriously among them, had clawed away a Chinese territory. So we had Hong Kong, we had all the treaty ports up and down the Yangtze. The French had Hainan in the south, the Germans had the Shandong Peninsula, the Russians and the Japanese had Dongbei, Manchuria. So the territory of this once proud country was being taken away by Westerners. Emerson, the American poet and philosopher, had called it this booby nation, a country that was only good for the making of rhubarb and silk and ceramics and tea. It had no importance in the world. The empire itself had fallen in 1911. The place had been riven with warlordism and corruption. And then, of course, in 1937, the Japanese had mounted a full-scale invasion and war against China, which was afflicting the place at the time that Needham was learning Chinese and falling in love with the country. Well, by 1941-42, the situation was such that almost all of eastern China was in Japanese hands. And an extraordinary thing had happened, something which hasn't really been written about and I think should be in a popular book. Chinese universities, many of them very ancient universities in cities like Beijing and Shanghai and Nanjing, which were the target of attacks by the Japanese. The Japanese loathed Chinese intellectuals. Instead of closing down these universities, which were being ruined and despoiled and books burned and so forth, the professors and the students and the faculty decided to up sticks and move their universities, putting all their blackboards and books and Bunsen burners and things on the back of donkeys and mules and on their own backs, and walk, often thousands of miles across the middle of China, into free China, into free Western Chinese cities, and set themselves up as refugee universities in the west of the country. And so Beijing University set itself up in Kunming, and Shanghai universities set themselves up in Chengdu and cities like that. And in 1942, a professor from one of these universities managed to get out to England and issued a plea to the British government: you've got to help us. Chinese intellectual life is dying. We've got the Himalayas on the one side of us, we've got the Japanese army on the other. We have no supplies, we have no books, we have no access to scientific papers, any news, nothing. Will you help us? Well, at first, both the British and the Americans remained neutral, but eventually it was decided, and specifically by Winston Churchill himself, that the British would indeed help the Chinese universities. There was one way of getting supplies into Western China, and that was this extraordinarily difficult air bridge between Calcutta and Kunming, maintained largely by the Americans, called flying over the hump. So the British decided that they would send someone to China to travel to all these universities and academic and intellectual and industrial organizations to find out what was needed, tell London, it would be sent to Calcutta, put on planes to go over the bridge, and distributed from Kunming. Well, the man they decided to send was this tall, exuberant, boisterous, loud lover of China and scientist, Joseph Needham. And in late 1942, he was put on a convoy, sent through the Mediterranean, Suez Canal, around past Bombay and Colombo, and he arrived in Calcutta, where he was given the post of counselor in the British diplomatic service, was given a military uniform, given a gun. He had never fired a gun in his life before, he never held a gun, but anyway, he had one now. And then in early 1943, he was put on an American plane, which took off from Dum Dum Airport in Calcutta, made a refueling stop in Assam, and in March 1943, middle of March, 15th, I think it was, he arrived in the city of Kunming, whereupon another epiphany, rather like the one that took place in his bedroom in K1 in 1938, took place. Just before he left for China, he had been to see been to see Gui Zhen, who was here in New York. She was teaching at Columbia. And she said, look, I'm so glad you're going to China, but do me a favor. Don't regard China as backward, impoverished, laughable. Don't regard it with disdain. The Chinese I know, my father, he was a well-known pharmacologist in Nanjing, know that China's achievements are legion. Keep an open mind in everything you see, and just think that China has made many more achievements than most Westerners believe. And so he did have this ringing in his ears, I think, when he arrived. And indeed, looking at his diary again, on that very first day he arrived in Kunming, he records something that triggered the next 3 or 4 years of rigorous inquiry into China. What happened was this. He went for a walk. He stayed with the British Consul General, a man called Alwyn Ogden, but he went for a walk that afternoon once he had got to get his bearings, and he sat in the sunshine. It was a crisp, early spring day, and he records the early flowers beginning to bloom. He loved the Chinese architecture, which for the first time he'd seen in real life, with their up-tilted eaves. He could see the snow on the distant hills of Tibet over in the west, and he sat smoking, of course, watching idly as an old Chinese man in a little Tibetan cap, as he wrote, was top grafting a plum tree. And he'd watched him idly, and then he thought, the way this man is grafting this plum tree is different from the way that I remember my father grafting a fruit tree we had in our back garden in Clapham in London. I think I'll ask him about it. He'd never spoken to anyone, obviously in China, in Chinese, but he went and started asking questions in the Chinese that Gustav Halun and Gui Zhen had taught him in China, and found, extraordinarily, marvelously, that this man could understand what he was saying and that he could understand the replies. And he asked him questions about this technique. And he realized that if he went back to the archives in Kunming, he could probably find papers relating to this grafting technique and find out how old it was. And then he had to send a telegram to botanists, friends of his in Cambridge and in London and at Harvard. Well, he did all of this and found out by the end of that first week that fruit grafting techniques were 600 years older in China than any fruit grafting techniques ever recorded in Greece, in classical civilizations, and certainly in Europe. So he thought, my word, Guo is right. Maybe I should open my eyes and start looking, doing my duties for the British government, yes, finding out what's needed, but also trying to determine what the Chinese might have invented, discovered, adopted, or whatever, long before people in the West. And so that really, he's traveled hundreds of thousands of miles through China over the next 4 years in a beaten down old Chevrolet truck that belonged to the American Air Force, not only doing his job for the British government, but also asking and finding out and looking in the archives and having discussions. And he found out in very short order that those three things that Francis Bacon had said in the 17th century most defined modern humankind, which was printing, gunpowder, and the use of the compass. When Bacon identified those three things as being hugely important, no one had any idea who first invented or came up with these things. Needham was able to show that the first printing ever in the world, I mean, we have thought, I suppose, it was Caxton or Gutenberg in the 15th century. Not at all. There's a book printed with movable block type in a cave in Dunhuang in Western China. The book itself is in the British Museum. It's called the Diamond Sutra, printed in 868 AD, 600 years before the West. Gunpowder. We sort of knew vaguely that the Chinese had invented explosive powder, but it was only being used, we thought, for fireworks and sort of decorative. Not at all. 8th century AD, Needham was able to find siege cannons and bombs made by the Chinese using gunpowder composed of saltpeter and charcoal and sulfur. And the compass. If we thought about it at all, probably the Arabs, possibly sailors, the Phoenicians had used compasses in the 13th and 14th centuries. Recorded documents that Needham was able to translate showed that the Chinese had used it in the East China Sea, south-pointing compasses, admittedly, in the 10th century, 300 years before anyone in the West. So one after another, these assumptions that the West had enjoyed primacy in invention fell, and the Chinese were shown to have invented an enormous number of things: the stirrup, the chain, the suspension bridge, the segmented arch bridge, blast furnaces, vaccination against smallpox, all of these things, air conditioning fans, all of them invented by the Chinese. Toilet paper, for heaven's sake. I mean, I assume we think, if we do think about toilet paper at all, it was invented by the Americans or Procter & Gamble or something in the 19th century. Not at all. There are records showing that soft, perfumed paper in squares, large one, 3 feet by 2, which is somewhat improbable, but smaller ones, 6 inches by 4, for the obviously more delicately shaped posteriors of the Beijing aristocracy, were being sold in 1341. So Needham decided that he would make a catalogue, as it were, of Chinese firsts, but at the same time he was haunted by the thought that, yes, ancient Chinese had invented an awful lot of things, but it seemed that sometime in the 16th century, all this inventive energy ground to a halt, and suddenly the inventive spirit of the world moved, lock, stock, and barrel, to the West, such that there was no doubt that there was a Chinese Euclid and there was a Chinese Archimedes, but there was never to be a Chinese Galileo, never to be a Chinese Copernicus, never to be a Chinese Einstein. Why was that? And this, why did it all come to an end, became the defining question that occupied Needham for the rest of his life, came to be known. It's become eponymized. It is the Needham question. Well, I'm not going to gloss over the details. I followed in all of his journeys and had all sorts of superb and amazing adventures. He came back in 1946 when the war was over. He didn't go straight back to Cambridge because his friend Julian Huxley asked him to go to Paris to help found UNESCO. UNESCO, trivial point, but it's perhaps worth remembering, was going to be called UNESCO, the United Nations Educational and Cultural Organization. but Needham argued that science belonged to humankind as a whole, and argued very vocally and evidently successfully that science should be incorporated. So if for no other reason, Needham should be remembered as the man who put the S in UNESCO. Came back to Cambridge in 1948 and resumed his duties teaching biochemistry, but also he decided he was going to write a book. He was going to call it Science and Civilization in China. He wrote to Cambridge University Press and proposed a book which would take him 2 years and would be 1 volume. Well, rather like James Murray trying to write the Oxford English Dictionary, thought it would be 4 volumes. It's now 20. Needham woefully underestimated the task. He wrote back to Cambridge within a year saying it should be 3 volumes. Then looking at the correspondence, 6 months later, he said, well, maybe 5, and then, well, actually 7, and maybe part 4 can be divided into 3 parts, well, maybe 5 parts, and so it went on. By the time he died in 1995, the book was 17 volumes long, 3.5 million words, all essentially done by him. And the book now, the 24th volume on metallurgy, came out about a month ago. Well, his achievement in changing the way that the West regards China, changing this view from disdain to respect and admiration and awe. Someone wrote to me after the Beijing Olympics and said, you realize that that procession of Chinese achievements that was in the opening panorama, we, the Chinese, didn't know that we had made so much. It was thanks to your man, Joseph Needham, who was known in China as Li Yusi. Li Yusi taught us. He didn't merely change the West's attitude to China, but he made us feel good about ourselves, which is no mean achievement. I want to finish this by telling just 2 very brief, one's not so brief, but sort of personal things. First of all, Needham's personal life. He remained married to Dorothy for the rest of his life. She died ultimately having written a book called The Machina Carnis, the meat machine. She died in 1987. Whereupon he then married Guo Hong, who had been waiting patiently in the wings for 51 years. He didn't say anything about this will be a thoroughly modern marriage when he married her in 1987. He did say, better late than never. She was not well, and she lived for, I think, only about 800 days, and she died in 1989, whereupon the old goat then wrote 3 further letters of proposal to 3 other women. All of them, I mean, he's 89 now, beginning to creak somewhat, but maybe the hormones were still running, but the body couldn't quite follow along, and all of them very sensibly, I think, turned him down. He was then living as a bachelor in Cambridge. He was given the Companionship of Honor, which is the greatest honor that the Queen can bestow on a civilian, in 1992, and then he died in 1995. And his ashes and the ashes of Dorothy and the ashes of Guo Hong are all commingled under a tree in the courtyard of the Needham Research Institute, which keeps on the work that he started. The other final thing I want to say or relate to is a story which is personal to myself and my wife, but it tells 2 things. One, about the importance of Needham in China, and also about his belief in the ultimate primacy of China, believing that China would take over from the United States and other Western countries and resume what he believed is China's rightful position in the world. About 2 years ago now, I was in Washington, D.C. My wife worked at the time for National Public Radio, and she was working on a book for the following morning, and we were both busy and tired, and we decided that we wouldn't either cook or go out for dinner, but we would send out for food, and not unsurprisingly for Chinese food. So there's a restaurant that she particularly likes called Mr. Chen's Organic Chinese Restaurant, which seems something of a contradiction in terms to me, but nonetheless, it's on Connecticut Avenue. So we rang them up and ordered the standard stuff one orders, and we were told it would be delivered in 45 minutes at 8:30. Sure enough, at 8:30, doorbell rings, and there's a small Chinese man standing outside with 2 plastic bags. And we realized, to our horror, dismay, and chagrin, that we don't have enough money, that the bill is for $40 and we've only got $7 in cash or something like that. But he's terribly nice and says, there's an ATM down in the street. So gave the plastic bags to my wife, and she started laying the table, and I went and got my ATM card, walked along with this chap to the lift, to go down to the street to get the money, but the lift wouldn't come. And so I was forced to make conversation. So I said, "Where are you from?" And he said, "Shanghai." And I know Shanghai quite well, so we talked a bit about Shanghai. But then the conversation sort of stilled a bit, and I began to sort of whistle tunelessly and look at my shoes and things. And then I suddenly remembered what book I was writing. And I said, "Oh, I'm writing a book about Joseph Needham." And he looked completely uninterested in this revelation. But then I remembered his Chinese name, and I said, "Liu Se." And he came alive. He said, "You're writing a book about Liu Se?" I said, "You've heard of him?" He said, "Of course I have. Every Chinese person with any intelligence has heard of Liu Se, the most famous Englishman that he completely changed the West's view of China. He's wonderful." I said, "This is amazing. One sale I'm going to get. I love you. I mean, back in the apartment, I said, "I've got books and papers and photographs and diary entries. Would you like?" "Yes, I'd love to come and see them." So I went back to the apartment. My wife, somewhat surprised that instead of turning up, I bring the delivery guy back. I said, "This man knows Liu Se." So I got out a few books and things. And after about 5 minutes, she said, "It's very nice, but I think actually he's being polite. I think he just would like his money." So I said, "Yes, I'm just being oafish and insensitive." So I said, "All right." So we went back to the lift together, went down to the street. The lift came this time, went to the ATM, got the money out, gave him his money, gave him his tip. And I said, "Well, this has been wonderful meeting you. I mean, I'm so thrilled. Someone knows Liu Se. Goodbye." And the book is on sale in a year or something. And nice to meet you. Farewell. And I walked off back to the apartment. Well, as I was doing so, I was aware of footsteps just behind me. And Washington being Washington, I looked around somewhat nervously to see it was the delivery guy walking in lockstep just behind me. And clearly he had parked his car or his bike or whatever it was near the entrance to the apartment. Well, even though the conversation had officially ended, it seemed churlish not to continue. So I said, "When you lived in Shanghai, what job did you have?" And he said, "Well, I used to work in the computer department of the Standard Chartered Bank." Well, I knew one tiny trivial fact about the history of the Standard Chartered Bank in Shanghai. It used to be a Scottish bank called Macaulay's Bank, and it's known colloquially in Shanghai as Macaulay Bank. And so I said to him, "Macaulay Bank." And he stopped dead still in the street and looked at me with an intense gaze and cocked his head to one side and said, "Simon?" And I looked back at him and I said, "Gordon?" It turned out that I had made a film about this man for the BBC 20 years before. And we stood there sort of hugging each other and remembering the details of this. And I remembered that in 1980, so we were doing the last 10 years of British Hong Kong, a series of 1-hour films once a year, watching as the colony became an integral part of China. And one of the devices we were going to use was to see how a Hong Kong banker and a Shanghai banker's lives would slowly converge. And we had chosen a chap from the Standard Chartered Bank in Hong Kong who lived a standard banker's life. He lived in Repulse Bay, he had a BMW, he had a wife that looked like a model, he took holidays in Phuket and Bali. And this chap, Gordon, Guo Hong, who lived in a 5th-floor walk-up in a slum in Shanghai covered with coal dust. He rode a rusty old bike. His wife assembled radios in a factory. We filmed him in 1987. We came back in 1988. We persuaded the colonial authorities to give him a visa to come to Hong Kong, and we filmed him meeting his opposite number in. And then in 1989, he came to me and he said, "My future, I think, Mr. Winchester, is in America. Can you help me get to America?" Well, I sponsored his visa application. I paid his first term's tuition at Drexel University in Philadelphia, and I put him on a plane from what was then Hongqiao Airport in Shanghai, a Northwest Airlines flight to Minneapolis with an onward connection to Philadelphia, and never saw him again. Until 20 years later, here we are hugging each other in Columbia Road Northwest. So I obviously took him up to the apartment again. And my wife, she said, "Why doesn't he just come and live here?" I said, "He's an old friend of mine. I know this chap." Anyway, he was sensitive enough to say, "I'll let you have your dinner, but I imagine there are some unanswered questions. I will arrange to take, with my wife, you and your wife out to dinner in a few days' time," as indeed he did, and told us his story, which was that he had got his PhD, and taking advantage of a Canadian government scheme that offered full citizenship to Chinese people with PhDs, he applied for and got Canadian citizenship. So he brought his wife over from Shanghai, and the two of them moved to Toronto, and he got a job for General Motors of Canada. Then in 1999, the two of them came back to the United States because he was offered a job by the Raytheon Corporation in Rockville, Maryland, working on some super secret communications protocol. September the 11th, 2001, no questions asked, all non-American citizens were summarily fired from this program. But because he had official Oracle and Microsoft qualifications, he was allowed to remain in America as a consultant. And that's what he did. But during this period, his view of the world changed, and no longer did he think of America was the center of the world. He began to believe that the center, at least for him, was his own country, China. So everything in his life now was determined by his desire to go back to China. So every day, his routine was unvarying. He would work from 8 in the morning till 6 at night doing his consulting work. 6 o'clock, he would pick up his wife. They'd have dinner together in Rockville. At 7 o'clock, armed with all his homework for the following day, he would drive down Connecticut Avenue, park outside the restaurant owned by his friend, Mr. Chen, organic restaurant in Connecticut Avenue, and read technical manuals for the following day. And if every 15 minutes or so, Mr. Chen came out with 2 plastic bags and said, please deliver this to 1521 Columbia Road, Northwest, Apartment 502, well, it was an extra $5 in tips. He thought he could add to the kitty, which would enable him to go back to the country which he believed would be soon the center of the world, his own country, China. Thank you very much indeed. Well, thank you. I know I've sort of slightly overrun, but if there are any questions I can try and answer, I'd be happy to try. Guo Hong. Yeah. He's leaving, I think, next month. We keep in touch, and he's got his money together. He's obviously delivered a lot of food, but he's going back, and he's absolutely implacable in his belief that, not that America, the sun is setting on America, he wouldn't be so rude as to say that, but the sun is certainly rising and will stay risen for China. So, well, there's a small but growing number of people who, like Needham, are completely obsessed. And of course, there were during the war, and one of them I talk about at some length in this book, who was a remarkable New Zealander called WWII, who went there largely because he was a communist, and he became, as Needham did, a great friend of Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai, particularly Zhou Enlai. But there are any number of, well, a small and very tightly knit clique of left-wing Americans, Canadians, and Britons who live there. But increasingly now, a number of Westerners are going, and just, obviously from the faces I'm seeing, many people here are Chinese, and so Chinese is no problem for you, but there are certain Westerners who find that when they learn Chinese, they're enraptured. It's almost like drinking the Kool-Aid, I suppose, and decide they must go there and live there. And I know many, and in fact, I was giving a talk on Saturday at something called the Philoctetes Center here in New York, and there was a woman there whose son, he's a lawyer, who just learned the Chinese language and said, I'm spending the rest of my life in China just studying it, and studying an incredibly tiny detail about Chinese life, because it's for him, and evidently for a large number of other people, an obsession which he thinks is transcendently wonderful thing to do. So if you're tempted, I would go. I'm tempted, I tell you. So. The language. I think it is really. I mean, something about the astonishing antiquity of China, and I do go into this in some deep detail about. One is fascinated, I think, by the self-assurance, the self-knowledge, the self-awareness of every Chinese person. I think that there is something very beguiling. So yes, I think it's a unique nation, and it has been, as Needham and others have mentioned a lot, ill-regarded. Now, the question is, how is it and how should it be regarded? And there is this slightly chilling, I end the book with a signboard that I saw outside a place called Juchuan in, I think it's either northern Sichuan, anyway, it's in western China, which is the main space center, where the latest astronaut was sent up a few days ago. In English, there's a big sign outside the Jiuquan Space Center, which simply says, "Without haste, without fear, we shall conquer the world." It's sort of chilling unless you take time to think, what does the word conquer mean in this context? Because China has never, and I'm not going to get into a Tibetan argument here, but China has not expanded her borders much in 5,000 years. She's been very content, believes herself to be the center of the world, Zhongguo, I mean, that's what Zhongguo means. And I think conquest to her means that, or to modern Chinese people, means that the Chinese way will at least be shown to many right-thinking people to be a legitimate alternative to the American way. That, you know, Hollywood and McDonald's and unbridled capitalism and so forth aren't necessarily the only right way to run the world. Perhaps Confucian principles, things like filial duty and so forth, might well take over. And I think that's all they mean.
You mentioned the year 1600 as being a cutoff point, but I know that it was until about 1800 or 1700, I can't remember what it was, they still had the highest GDP in the world. So clearly there was some sort of a transition period. What is your take on what caused the transition from being the wealthiest part of the world to being a fairly backwards part of the world for quite some time?
Well, it's an interesting subject which people much cleverer than I have devoted, PhD theses and so forth. Why did the Needham, what is the answer to the Needham question? Why did it all stop? Why did GDP ultimately plummet? Why did Europe gain the ascendancy? One answer is that to look at why Europe became so vibrant is that it was a place of so many competing states that the competition spurs technological innovation. I mean, if a sword maker, if Spain was at war with Holland and a sword maker in Toledo produces a weapon with an astonishingly sharp edge, then clearly it behooves the sword makers of Amsterdam and Rotterdam to make an even better one. So this kind of thing spurs technological innovation. Conflict does. China, by contrast, in this period, in the middle of the Ming and the early Qing, was essentially unified under the imperium of a very old-fashioned thinking Beijing, and the system placed as the summit of every young Chinese man's ambition not to become a lawyer or a scientist or a doctor, but to take the Confucian examinations to become a bureaucrat. And any system where the highest of all rewards is to be, or the highest of all ambitions is to simply be a bureaucrat that runs the country as it has always been run, is going to lead to ossification, I think, intellectual ossification. Having said all of that, though, I think it's fairly evident that since 1980, since Deng Xiaoping's remark about to get rich is glorious, that everything's changed, and that people are now going back because they want to participate in a China in which the Chinese universities clearly are now brimming with brains and ambition. And the number of patents filed by China, I think it went up 23% last year over the year before. It's now the 5th highest patent applying country in the world. It's as if suddenly, after a period of quiescence, maybe beginning in the 1700s, everything's roaring back. And so in the great spectrum of Chinese history, let's arbitrarily say it's 5,000 years, if there's a brief period from, let's say, 1700 to 1980, what's that, 280 years, that's almost a blip on the radar screen. So maybe had inventiveness and energy come to a crashing halt and never restarted, then the Needham question is a valid one. But if it merely went into hiatus, into hibernation, then maybe the Needham question is moot. Oh, beg your pardon, sir. Condition in the future and what problems she faces. Well, I mean, clearly the rich versus poor problem is going to, as education increases the sophistication of the poor, they're going to find their impoverished situation increasingly intolerable. So that's one thing that the Chinese leadership has to deal with. Pollution is obviously another one. I mean, you can't have unbridled capitalism. I don't know if you've been to cities like Lanzhou and Shenyang. I mean, they are so unbelievably filthy. So I think those are two, environmentally and socially, those are two major problems. Regionally, I think the accommodation that they seem to be striking with India is a good one, whereas I forget who it was who said, that the Indians make the software, we'll make the hardware. Well, simply saying there will be, instead of hostility over the Himalayas, there will be a sense of communion. That's a great relief. The Indians have got their own problems with the situation with Pakistan, but China and India, I think, the Aksai-Chin border problem is no longer as much of a problem as it used to be. So discounting India or relationship with India as a problem, I would say that it's environmental problems and social problems. And I think the Chinese leadership is wise enough. I mean, they're not fools. And I think they'll very slowly ease off the brakes as they've continued to do, and at the same time slow them down a little so that the growth isn't completely unbridled. And I'm optimistic. I think Gordon is right. I think that's the place to be. Thank you very much for coming along.